Welcome to another Mishmashing Battle Lounge with the 2MK team and a special guest, O'Shea Cruz. The freight train can't stop, won't stop. It looks like we've got the perfect person for tonight's theme without actually intending it to be that, but thanks to O'Shea for showing up because this is exactly the person we needed for the thing we're talking about today. Today we are working on the fact that a lot of our shortcomings have to do with not being able to get out of bad situations. And of course, there's obviously putting yourself in bad situations, but even if you avoided putting yourself in new bad situations, you'd end up in trouble if you got punished, got tricked in any way, and then just got pressured and died. This game offers a lot of ways out of bad situations, though it doesn't offer as many defensive options as many other games, and V-Shift only helps so much. One of the main things that you have to understand about getting out of bad situations in nearly every game of this type, i.e. every 2D fighting game, is that hitting buttons on wake up is the worst way to do that. It's not a useless way to do that, but it is the worst. And obviously, in almost all situations, blocking is only slightly better than pressing buttons immediately. The reasons for this should be pretty obvious, but we'll be going into them as we go through the stream. Feel free to join in and get more or less pummeled by the freight train, for as long as they are willing to hang around and pummel people. Don't be expecting a lot of other outcomes, honestly. But as far as I know, they probably find fighting us somewhat enjoyable, and therefore, I don't expect them to be rushing off. Though we are likely to see a bunch of different characters, so don't be going expecting to see Alex all day. We're not working all about or talking about how to recognize that you're in a bad situation. So anything you see with someone getting beat up in neutral, feel free to throw onto the stream chat why they're playing oddly and can fix it, but as an overall thing, we're not going to be talking about those aspects of it. We're talking about pressure and the moment before pressure. What do I mean when I say the moment before pressure? When you're knocked down, you should not be thinking about what to do. You should be thinking about what your opponent wants to do. Like, your character is going to get up. In fact, most of the time, if you fail to do your wake up for some reason, you'd be better off. Using variable timings for your wake up is one of the most important possible things here. And therefore sometimes just forgetting to press buttons on wake up to do the recovery is its own thing.
Let's do this.
So of course feel free to trickle in, as noted. Some of our other team members may have some problems with that.
Sakura, Alex. This will be perfect for a warm-up.
And it looks like we're getting more Sakura for the time being. A lot of this is, as usual, psychological. By the way, this is more or less an Atlantic Rim lounge, so if you are anywhere on the coast of the Atlantic Ocean or a little bit inland, especially with this player in the lounge, you should be able to get a good connection to everyone in the lounge as of now.
Fight.
So, how best to deal with this situation when your opponent is on top of you and you're not sure what else to do? Main thing, watch the opponent. Sakura is the perfect option here and needed to be chosen because Sakura is the one with the instant jumping air throw. Ibuki can do it too, but Ibuki would probably lead to a playstyle that's going to end up being worse. When knocked down, your opponent has about 6 options. And you have to be gutsier and gutsier to beat their gutsy options. It's well known that top players do things that don't seem to make sense, but that's because they're so deep into the thought process of everything that everyone else could be thinking to do, that the good ideas can become bad ideas. So you get things like Kazunoko, I believe, and not only am I going to hit a button, I'm going to hit crouch medium kick. Why? Because what I expect you to do is shimmy, and I expect you to shimmy without crouching. Because it depends on the character, for example. If you shimmy and your character's standing buttons are your only good combo starters, then yeah, it's not entirely ridiculous to hit this. Situations like that are also pressure, and those are the ones you probably have to care about more. When someone V-cancels on you, most of the time, especially if it looked like it was in any way just confidence, most of the time you are about to experience a mix-up. And it can't necessarily be all that poor a mix-up, because if it was, your opponent would learn not to do that. But that does not mean that you should feel bad if you get hit. It's just, that's it. It's a mix-up. That's what happens. This, for example, is potentially a mix-up, but you notice my opponent walked away. That could mean they're going for something to chase my backdash, or it could mean that they're just not interested in pressuring right now. I think I've never seen this win quote. This is not a common matchup. Also a good start, because I don't really have a lot to talk about relative to it at this level. Our Sakura is mostly working her way through the Alex matchup as a whole. You can just more or less mash medium kick, but Alex will get through this pretty fast. A better way to put it would be, you can hit medium kick whenever you think that Alex has done pressure, or doesn't have valid pressure yet. Because he almost always has to stick a button forward, and most of the time it's not going to trade, for various reasons. Unfortunately, this means you have to stand up. Crouch medium kick is equally effective if you're close, but can end up trading. The main good thing about the medium kick is the same thing it usually is, similar to our Ryu Kata. You can block quickly enough after this move that most of the time you're okay. That stun bar is suspicious. I think that would have stunned.
You lose.
Another thing that Sakura does relatively well in this matchup is get good timings for throw. Basically, as soon as she hits the medium kick enough times, Alex's playstyle has to change a little bit and throws become a much better option for her. Usually she has to walk forward slightly for them, or think that it's going to be a good idea to wake up with it, more or less. But in combination with some other things she does, it's pretty good. Since she's not really a character that can just get positional advantage, this turns out to be a lot like the Lara matchup. She does benefit from activating her V-trigger, in that she just gets to B+ at good ranges, the end. And since the move technically counts as a special, it tends to trade instead of getting beat out by Alex buttons. It's a bit easier in this matchup, especially against this player, to also not end up pressing for too many Hadokens with it on. In fact, to the point where Alex's better option, a lot of the time, is to just back off and see if you can get Sakura to throw more projectiles and waste the meter. After all, advancing on Alex isn't safe enough that she can just choose to do this. So this is mostly about figuring out the max range of that, and as you can see, the move is similarly useful for a lot of things. It also does a good job of punishing some stuff that Alex would like to do, and still getting enough of a combo to not be terrible. But none of that has anything to do with how to get out of bad situations. That's just getting us to the point where the bad situations are not the entire match. It's very hard to get good use out of her skill 1 in this matchup, since Alex tends to be prepared for this, but she can often backdash into suddenly doing it on a chase. Not a great idea now, but you know, if you're thinking of how do I use this move here, try backdashing out of Alex's stuff first if you're not in the corner, and then maybe you'll get a chance to do it when he's on his way back in.
You lose.
So back to discussing escapes as a generality. There are certain ways you can think about this to figure out which escapes you probably should use, which has the highest chance of being successful, and that's usually against a character. At minimum, you can think about, I'm going to avoid taking damage, and that's good.
It's go time. Let's do this.
So starting from there, you have to spend most of your time thinking, what can't this character do? In Abigail's case, for example, we often suggest forward jumping when you're under Abigail pressure and think you might get hit. Mainly because Abigail doesn't actually do that much to a person who has jumped over his head. There are definitely people with the skill to hit you with reasonably powerful Abigail combos, but they often need meter for this. This is going to be a little bit more daring, therefore. Since this player doesn't really use Alex's stomps, the benefits of playing Karin are a little bit less. Technically, Sakura might be better off, but there's a stomp. Maybe it's dependent on character. But whereas Sakura basically has an on-demand anti-air, Karin is going to be suffering a lot more in this part of this matchup, and therefore likely to get jumped on significantly more. Not to mention the fact that Alex often occupies a space where it's good for this to happen. There's just too much to react to when you're playing Karin here. And unlike Shoto's, which technically includes Sakura, you can't just light uppercut your way through the whole matchup. Even if you were to try to light Tenko, it would probably sort of help a little bit, but not a lot. Ibuki faces similar problems. And without an air throw to handle very quick close range air situations,
You lose.
it's a little rougher to say the least. You can solve this by playing Karin fairly aggressively. But playing against a player with this level of, let's call it determination,
Round one.
means that if you do, you're not necessarily going to get a whole lot out of it. Fortunately, Karin can at least reach enough to get some whiff punishes in there. She is, however, better for demonstrating the thing we're talking about because, unlike Sakura, so many of the things Karine does on offense put her into that situation. Where she now has to think of, okay, I've been blocked and now I need to get out of here.
Round 2. Fight.
She can of course do basically the same thing, hit the medium kick, assume she won't get whiff punished, watch for what happens after the medium kick. But she doesn't necessarily have any great options for if Alex decides, okay, I'm coming straight at you now. The timing for most of the things required is a little bit too rough. So, let's go through them in order. If you have space behind you, or if you have a character whose back jump, heavy kick, or medium kick has a nice downward aiming hitbox, there are many situations where a back jump is in fact a good idea. This is particularly true when your opponent character doesn't have a great, easy standing medium punch or whatever anti-air.
Let's do this. Sakura. Alex.
This will be perfect for a warm-up.
Round 1. Fight.
So let's look at your main options. If your opponent's character has no good instant just upward facing anti-air, or one that won't reward them too much without, let's say, a cross-up or something, then often you do the jump back, especially if their moves take kind of long to animate, and hope that they went for some weird pressure that you ended up jump back and then kicking them. This is obviously only the most effective option you've got if your opponent has that limitation on their character. Alex isn't really this type of character. Alex can respond to back jumps and neutral jumps with quite a lot of options. And not many of them are particularly difficult, and mostly they don't lead into bad situations for Alex. What Alex isn't quite as good at, especially if you're cornered, is dealing with forward jumps. However, as a character who has really, really long moves, you can at least force Alex to go for pressure that causes your block on wake up. And that brings us on to the point. If you block on wake up, you can often V-reversal your opponent if they use the heavier move, which will at least get you out of the situation, even though it's expensive.
Round 1.
It's also guaranteed once they've used that heavier button. You don't have to worry about being baited or it not working or any of those things. You just do it, and now hopefully they're knocked away or you have escaped, and that's it. If your opponent's character relies a lot on pressing buttons in a sequence, then the new V-Shift really helps. The reversals tend to help less, not because you won't manage the V-reversal all the time, but because those characters tend to start those strings of buttons with things that don't push them back too far, because otherwise they wouldn't be able to hit more buttons anyway. And often that means that they could recognize that the V-reversal is going to happen and go for either a regular throw or a command throw, and in both of those cases your V-reversal does nothing to help you. Still, it's a completely valid option, especially if you've got a lot of meter, the situation is already bad, and you know that you're basically only going to get out of this one way. Obviously, once you've activated a V-trigger in a situation like this, you're not going to get much out of it. And you see the correct play here by O'Shea or Cruz of, I'm going to back off and see if I can get you to waste that on projectiles. Alex players are often very good at their footwork and make sure that their position is right. All that dashing backward and forward does tend to help.
Let's do this.
So aside from just blocking and therefore V-reversal and either a backward or forward jump, there are a few characters where just neutral jumping is a good enough idea. There are characters that have like instant jump attacks that will help them get out of these situations, particularly against tall characters like Alex. But because that's so uncommon, relatively speaking, it's not something you just give as advice to everyone. If you have this sort of thing, definitely consider using it. It usually doesn't lose too much. Because most of the time, as noted, if your opponent doesn't have a really long animation style move that still gives them advantage, notably that Alex does have this type of move, but if they don't have that type of move, normally if you do get hit in the startup frames of your jump, you tend to end up flipping into the air and some less damage is often done because they didn't get any combos or massive setups on you.
Fight.
Now, this isn't necessarily getting out of the situation. You've usually gotten hit, and most of the time, you don't get to do anything right then. But, let's say your character has the main other option, an invincible uppercut or something similar. It's often better to spend your invincible uppercut time right then, because your opponent is suddenly focused on catching you out of that situation. They have gone for an attack, they definitely intended to keep on hitting you, they're on the offense in their mind, and now they're hitting more buttons. The fact that they hit more buttons often means you can do a lot of different things. Certainly that your escape is more likely to be useful if you do have an invincible move to use. But all of that is, what do I do if I'm in the corner? If you're mid-screen, you have new options. Technically you have these options in the corner too, but most people don't use them. V-Shift is a good way to avoid attacks and continue your own, especially if, as noted, your opponent's likely to hit a lot of buttons in sequence. The V-Shift does a better job than the V-Reversal, because the V-Shift will at least save you if they try to throw. Now, depending on the character, they can even react to this still and have ways out of the situation. But, as an overall thing, you should still be able to do this often enough that you'll probably feel that wasn't a total waste, or that wasn't a big loss, even if you get caught and they were ready for it.
Alex wins.
This is probably the reason why the V-Shift has that big slowdown, so that certain people can recognize things.
one. Fight!
And that brings us back down to what we said at the beginning. So you've got your back jumping heavy kick, your forward jump, assuming you're going to get hit, but just not caring as much because the character uses charge moves or something and you're not likely to die. Blocking, but with the intention of V-reversal. And V-shifting, or backdashing. And after that, we finally get down to the bottom tier of escapes, namely, mashing buttons slash doing an invincible wake up. Those two are functionally the same thing because technically an invincible wake up will help you in many more situations, but one costs meter, and in almost every case in this game requires that you open yourself up to a massive punish if you are wrong. Interesting interaction. And finally, therefore, just hitting buttons is the same as that because now you're not even invincible, you're just assuming your opponent is going to mess up their meaty, assuming they really did one, or that your buttons are good enough to win, or that they were going to try something your buttons beat somehow. It does happen. And for many characters who have good pressure strings and similar, this is a good enough thing to be doing simply because if you get away with it, you normally get to start your own offense at close range. Characters like Kage, Ken, to some extent Ibuki, this is a decent way for them to deal with situations sometimes.
Let's do this.
What most people don't teach you about is the delayed button wake up. And the delayed button wake up is mostly there for when you think your opponent is going to wait for you to do something and then start hitting more buttons. But this isn't really that sort of situation. While it is something that high-level players think of that way, it isn't something you really have to think about in the same way at lower levels. Not because your opponent has no chance of this situation coming up, but simply that not only would you have to get the timing right, you probably had to make some sort of read as to why they're doing it. Still, getting yourself to delay your button long enough is a good thing. You should generally think about it in terms of this. I have just woken up. I'm going to wait just about the amount of time it would take me to tell whether or not my opponent made an attack or went for a throw or did block stun. But the main problem you face in this case is that in order for delayed buttons to generally work on most characters, it has to be like punch, because otherwise your opponent is going to throw you and you won't be able to change yourself to the throw tech input quickly enough unless you have a separate throw button, and even then it's still difficult. Similarly, players who know you're going to do this don't really have a good reason to not just go for meaties every time. They might as well. So when you're facing players who are either stronger than you or don't know that much about the game to understand why they would want to do anything else, i.e. shimmies, weird neutral jump setups, etc., then you're not really getting anything out of this. Think of this as the elusive 7th member of the rainbow of wake-ups. Only when you have gotten through the point of everything else to the point where you understand everything else that's going on and think to yourself, huh, none of the things I want to do here tend to work on this player. Then you can start working in the delayed button on wake up. There are a few characters for whom this delayed button on wake up is actually crouch light kick, and I think for Ed and Bison it actually is standing light kick, which isn't great for them because, you know, obviously it leaves them open to opposing crouch light kicks, but all of this is character dependent. If your opponent's character doesn't have a good anything off their crouch light kick, then go for it. And if they do, think about it differently. Unfortunately for you, most grapplers in this game have a good-ish, if not great, not pressure, but setups that involve them getting close to you and hitting their crouch light kicks. So you end up with a drastically reduced set of options. Fortunately, grapplers get a lot of their damage off of going for a throw on your wake up or getting in at the right timing to go for throw after pressure, which you can often neutral jump out of. The neutral jump being a thing you use against them simply because it offers you the biggest chance to actually punish them for stuff they're doing. And that's also the reason we didn't mention it before. To go for the neutral jump, even on a grappler, is riskier than going for either the back jump in the corner, depending on your character, or the forward jump. But if you are relatively sure they're going for the command grab specifically, you can get much more out of it. If you're not sure of this, be aware that doing a neutral jump on your wake up, your opponent's timing for their throw, a lot of these characters get to hit another button right after that and knock you out of your neutral jump situation, which can be very...
Let's do this. Round one. Fight!
Now here's an interesting matchup for this situation. Guile is notoriously bad at escaping. It's not well known because, like, top players of Guile make it look easy. But in general, this character's escapes suck. The directions of his attack buttons make it super hard to actually land anything good. He has hops over lows that lose to other things but make it even easier for you to get the confirms. His V reversal, while good, doesn't lead to any great situations immediately. And he doesn't benefit that much from trying to outspace people with shimmies or anything else, or rather people who are trying to shimmy him. The strongest aspect of most Guile's play is that, one, they're so used to doing this sort of thing, and two, EX Flash Kick is easy. But even that can mess you up, because as a person who plays a character with charge, invincible moves, your opponent can do some stuff to make it feel like you should be able to EX out, and then fake it in various ways so that your EX timing is messed up. It's hard to remember, though, that if you think you've managed to get your opponent to try their EX Flash Kick and mistime it in any way, that they now can't do it again and you should just do whatever you want. On defense, Guile was therefore given one of the most important parts of his own game plan. Guile's crouching light punch, if he can manage to get to a situation where you went up in front of Guile, thought it was a good idea to block because you thought he was going to flash kick, and you give him the chance to hit that light punch, now he's out. This is super important to think about. The threat of the EX Flash Kick is the thing that allows Guile to get out of pressure, not necessarily because he does the EX Flash Kick, but because it lets him hit you with Crouch Light Punch or Crouch Light Kick. More so the Crouch Light Punch than anything else. Now there are many ways around this, but from Guile's perspective, it makes him the solid tanky style character that he is. He basically goes, okay, I'm either betting big, or the fact that you are afraid of me betting big is my answer to the situation. Very valid. But it also means that if you play Guile for long enough, it will force you to learn all of these things. Unlike other characters, where you could still have an invincible move, but you still end up learning, okay, I definitely have to do this. Can't be sure if they're a little laggy or something else, but Guile's big problem against Alex is that Alex has a lot of health. Alex can take a lot of EX flash kicks. When you have used up enough of your energy, Alex doesn't care as much anymore. Not only all of that be true, but Alex does a ton of damage if he happens to bait it. And I mean a ton of damage. So, as the Alex player, you should feel nothing whatsoever when you get hit with an EX flash kick. It doesn't even really have good pressure on it. It's there, but not enough that a high energy character like Alex cares when in this matchup. No, I'm just gonna charge at you anyway because I can. Which often results in this situation where you see Guile playing a relatively large amount of offense, which is quite good. Alex tends to move around a lot and doesn't benefit that much from just blocking Guile's mid-range stuff, so there's still some benefit on that end. But this situation, for example, is terrible. You have half health, don't care. If you reversal me off, probably still don't care. You have messed up even the slightest part of your escape, and therefore I don't care. That time though, I feel as if they were probably thinking in terms of, oh wait, I have the other V trigger. Maybe that would have worked there. It's a little harder to do this on the V trigger that Auge Cruz has chosen, not because Guile will never stand up and get hit by the DDT, or even that you can't like do the elbow or the flash chop and get in. It's just a much higher cost when it comes to doing your own pressure. Your own pressure is meaningfully harder. That's more of a damage conversion situation for when you think the situation won't go your way as often as you want. But one good way to think about this sometimes, though it's a tangent, is that if you are at the point where you have V-meter, through using this particular setup, it's usually because Guile has meter, and that means that your pressure is always in danger. So I would suggest that if you're going to play this particular V-trigger against Guile, as Alex, you have to have a fairly strong understanding of the player's style. You could just be confident based on your skills in general, but if you were throwing yourself into a tournament, most tournaments I believe let you not change character but change V-trigger after the round. I would almost certainly open with the parry simply because it gives you more chances to go in and go ham. Plus, Guile players do have the tendency to try to get themselves out of these situations by hitting specific things. Oof, that was a big miss. But I'm not sure if it's laggy enough that that combo dropped. Another good reason is that interaction you just saw. It's commoner at higher levels. You're not likely to be as familiar with it if you're still just struggling your way into gold, but you definitely see it. You do the back jump or the sometimes neutral jump, because when your opponent does block, they have to stand block first of all. that was the other thing that isn't necessarily obvious that I mentioned before. If you do the back jump for the hit, or the neutral jump for the hit, your opponent has to stand block it, which means if they had charge, and for whatever reason weren't going to hold it all the way and then go for flash kick or whatever, then it's gone. That's step one. And secondarily, they often end up V-reversaling the spot, which for Alex is usually a sign that you're going to get damage somewhere.
Guile win.
So, probably stressful, probably laggy. But no one stops the freight train, and therefore I had no expectation that they were suddenly going to just start sitting around and waiting to see what happened. Yeah, figures. Although it looks like it might have been on their end for a little bit. Can't be sure. Well, I guess we're about to find out this way. Even though the connection isn't always great in any given direction, maybe we'll see what happens.
Let's do this.
Assuming they stick around, they're certain to be back on top pretty soon. So we have a Juri avatar that is playing Guile, and will back off in order to get themselves enough space if they've got a big space behind them. In other words, the standard. But we see Ilara this time, which honestly normally does not mean the same thing, but there are definitely zoning Laras out there. Justfine does have quite a bit of experience with that style of player though, and Lara isn't so hard to beat on Bison when she's in zoning mode. Actually, it's probably one of the easier styles of matchup in the game. When she's going full pressure, you have to, you know, constantly be on your toes, but if she's in zoning mode, you don't really have to do too much. You kind of just sit there and let her kill herself.
Round one.
Especially when she has no meter. Here's the exact thing to think about. If this match went to the point where Lara got meter, then Bison has to care about a ton of things. Your goal should be to do as much damage as you can before Lara gets any meter at all. Just sit there and build up your life lead, because your opponent needs the meter to get in on Bison to the strength level required. Therefore, you end up a round up, but only one bar down, more or less. If you can get your opponent to waste it, or just not care, it often works out. Now that Lara has meter, Bison can play a little more aggressively, because, you know, she's going to be coming in and using it anyway. Technically, the more stressfully you can play, the more likely you are to make her waste it. And also, to note, it doesn't seem to be all that, like, terrible on this side, so it might have been O'Shea or Cruz's connection just for a bit. And here's your other reason. Bison can use his V-reversal explicitly to get out of a lot of things. V-shift also helps a lot. Ooh, armored. But now the meter's gone, so even if this match turns around and Bison loses through whatever means, we're still back to only worrying about 1 meter. And you'll notice again that our Lara ended up not really playing all that zony, because it doesn't work well. So at least we get that level of interesting. Stuff is happening now. But as noted, Bison has to be on toes a lot in this matchup when Lara is playing aggressively. Some people find this interesting and some people hate it entirely. But our Lara bot does a good enough job of showing this off that you might care. So mostly this looks like it's going pretty well in terms of both players doing exactly what they intend to do almost all of the time. The big problem here, if you could say it is a problem, is that Bison doesn't really have a solution to that setup other than to let the
Lara wins.
clap wear off. And that's zoning Lara's strength. She has a shield. She just puts it in front of her and a certain subset of characters can do literally nothing about it. You can't even dash through it because she will just react to the fact that you did that.
Round one. Fight.
But overall, it was a good match, and looks like it's going to be another similar one. But we're back to the same start. There's no real benefit here to Bison to letting Lara do anything, because once she gets meter, you have to care more. And this time, it got sorta wasted, but now she's in, and the whole escape thing has to happen. Bison has a long enough jump though that he actually can use the forward jump escape versus Lara on knockdowns or even in close range like this. Most characters do not have this available to them. They don't jump far enough forward to avoid Lara just walking backward and hitting her stand medium punch. But Bison will barely make it out of this without any serious threat to himself. This is even stronger when he is in V-Trigger, either V-Trigger, because he has so many other options. But the real thing that would have helped the highest amount here, I believe, would have been choosing V-Skill 2, because if you're fighting zoning Lara, being able to Hell Warp, even if it's dangerous, helps you. The Lara player can't just stand there because she'll just lose by other stuff going on. But she also can't just suddenly approach because she doesn't move quite fast enough to always be out of the way of the Hell Warp. It's basically a way to put as much stress on the player playing Lara as you have on yourself. And this is something we've discussed on many streams before. You can decide how to deal with your opponent based on what other characters you've seen them play, particularly in lounges. So seeing a back-off style player, being able to go, this is probably zoning Lara, oh right, I was supposed to use this against that style of player, is enough to help you get your victory. But it's also good, especially in lounges, to get practice of the other kind, because if the thing that is deciding which V-skill or V-trigger you choose is your opponent's playstyle and not to their character, you can't do this in ranked. You'd have to know them by name. And of course, there are situations in which that's possible. The higher in rank you get, and the more likely you are to face particular people in your region, the better it works out for you to do this. To just go, oh, I've seen you before, I know what you fight like, I'll pick the appropriate thing. And partially, Lara actually needs that ability to put the clap out because of the fact that Bison can just jump out of her stuff. So we're going to chalk this one up to incorrect V-skill and V-trigger for the player, as being able to dash through just about anything and get to the other side would have been slightly more helpful. Oh, they did leave. Oh well. And off they go as well.
Let's do this.
So it brings us back to intra-team workout. Ironic, because we had actually put up the stream as Mix and Mash when we started, at least the stream title, incorrectly, but technically now would be the better Mix and Mash timing.
Nekali.
See you, Tim.
I guess it lets me rest my voice for a bit. And we're almost exactly 1 hour in. So I'll be back either when we have chosen to do more specific things, or potentially decided to spread out and have a tail end mix and mash style interaction.
Round 1. Fight! Round 2. Fight!
Interestingly, we're seeing very little use of the crawling beast in this interaction this time, which actually makes Sakura's job harder. There it is. Now it's easier again. Sakura manages better in this matchup when Necalli is generally either very far away or close and not doing anything, because there's no way to decide what action to take. She can try max range perfect timing on various Tatsus, and that can help quite a bit. In fact, one of her best approach options in the matchup as a whole is just to randomly EX Tatsu. But this is not a tool that our Sakura is used to using, although she could probably parallel it to the use of Mujinkaku, and hopefully it will have similar effects. The reason this works on Necalli is because as a character, Necalli takes a while to start up without moving. It prevents him from being in danger once the player has decided, oh, you've done a thing. But it's not as good at preventing opponents who have multi-hit moves that are coming toward him. It works decently on multi-hit projectiles for various reasons, or he just stays blocking. But honestly, your Tatsu's probably a pretty good help in this matchup as a whole. This is in no small part due to the fact that the Necalli players tend to want to either uppercut it or jump over it. But the uppercut does so little damage that you don't care, and the jumping over it often leads to them doing this preemptively and getting air thrown. And as you can see, it opens back up that spacing where Necalli can't afford to back off long enough for other stuff to happen, and therefore is, in some way, vulnerable to the usual, I'm going to cross you up now because you dared to move forward against me.
Round 2.
From Necalli's side, this has some pretty good answers though. One of the few characters in the game that benefits from using the neutral jump against Sakura specifically, because the range that they're at means that Sakura can't just go for an uppercut. And Necalli's air buttons being the type that technically are capable of trading with the uppercut Sakura must use. This also means that Sakura is likely to move a little closer and therefore be susceptible to things like dash up command grab. But bearing in mind that Necalli's command grab is longer in terms of how long it takes to animate, i.e. the startup frames are larger than most command throws, and the result is usually that you just don't manage it in time. She'll hit you with a light kick or something.
You win.
Honestly, one of your best overall options with Necalli is the style of Necalli we saw at the beginning of the game's lifespan. Necalli players got very, very good at building up lots of meter because of his good pushback buttons and then converting into super. But this isn't to say that they didn't hit reactive supers, because it's very similar to Chun and Ken, where you have a lot of space. So it doesn't really require that you stay close to your opponent. A lot of your goal is just, how long can I get you to keep on blocking me or having to care about my buttons to get up to having meter, because I don't need it for my standard game plan, and if I have meter, then you're always at risk of taking a massive amount of damage. Being able to hang back like this and fish for confirms or just react with the super is super helpful, because Necalli players don't always feel the need to get in. But if you don't bother trying to get in but you are lacking in life lead, he also doesn't have a lot of other big conversions from mid-range. Just the style of character. He's oppressive more so than he is super damaging in one shot without the super meter. But once you've got it, finding the right timing for it can be difficult, because your opponent is going to try to find ways around it. And that, as you've just seen, is where the dive kick comes in. You have the additional tension of, 1, being constantly on the watch for this move, and 2, knowing that if you mess it up you'll just get ES uppercut, which is not only super punishable, it wastes the meter and you end up back in a negative situation, having to build in a whole entire other meter for the situation to come out good for you. So there's a lot of practice with when to super that you have to work on in order for this to be helpful to you. Playing more aggressively can help, but overall, there are not a lot of other solutions here. It's a lot of thinking about the scenario you're in, and fortunately Necalli often has quite a bit of time to think about these things. He's not a super I must be in your face every moment character, and because you have such relatively simplistic attack and block strings, you can just go, alright, well, I'll just think about how this match should go. I'm not sure if the last time these two faced off we saw the Gil versus Necalli matchup, but I know that we are likely today. This is another situation where getting your escapes correct ends up being incredibly important. Necalli's best option against Gil a lot of the time is just to keep on pressing buttons. And Gil doesn't have a lot of ways to prevent this from being a good idea. Parrying and choosing parry as your V skill often helps quite a lot, because the other doesn't really help at all. But Necalli players can bait this, and Necalli has enough actual crush countery buttons that are technically part of pressure that, it still makes life hard. Because these buttons are often delayed relative to anything else, so you have to choose whether or not you're going to try to jab or light kick your way out of the situation, or parry, and if you parry and are wrong, big damage. Gil therefore often normally wants to just backdash. Necalli's chases are good, but not like taking out Gil in the standard scenario good. Neutral jumping into heavy kick or back jumping if you're in the corner also often helps a lot, but in terms of actual pressure, we're going to start talking about that when it comes up. Gil's armored moves are not great in terms of resolving or preventing the situation. And we've definitely discussed on stream before that if you think Necalli is going to play defensively, Gil's fiery step kick is basically your best option under all circumstances because it does good cancels, hits anyone who got frozen, which is a lot of people because this is technically the better trigger to be using here, and so on.
Round 2. Fight. Pyrokinesis. 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 Cryokinesis.
But managing the escape once Necalli is in can be a lot more complicated simply because you always have to worry about him just hitting more buttons and doing that more or less. Gil has no safe answers to that. Interestingly, you can often get away with it by going for either the EX or sometimes the normal version of his movesault E-drop. Basically, once Necalli seems to be far enough away, for lack of a better way of putting it, and you think you're under pressure, if you think backdashing was a bad idea for any reason, just go for knee drop. However, V-reversal is, as demonstrated, a much safer way to deal with this situation, and because of the style of buttons Necalli must be hitting, and the distance at which he must be standing for there to even be a real threat, you can count on it. It's something that comes up fairly often. The first thing you have to learn about V-reversals is the difference between an opponent who can get into range, either through the range of their command grab or their standard throw range, to bait the V-reversal, and those who are using long range buttons that are very dominant but end up so far away or so locked into animations that there's no chance of this V-reversal thing happening. They're either going to get hit by the V-reversal or nothing will happen. This is again, of course, assuming that you have a character whose V-reversal is a strike in the first place. Necalli does have ways to deal with the knee drop, but since his general attacks tend to be very, very forward and relatively long lasting, you're not likely to run into the problem. Once you understand that the knee drop can save you, it opens a realm of other possibilities, mainly because now you can see when it will work. And becoming confident in it means you have other options.
Gil wins.
This is not a common tactic to use with this character. There are very few characters in this game where your answer to a pseudo pressure situation is moonsault. Not to mention the fact that in order for the EX1 to hit on the way up, you have to be very close. But it is enough to help you understand, okay, this situation doesn't look like it suits me, therefore I should probably do this because I don't understand it. And a large part of the reason why this is important is that escapes are not always about actually escaping your opponent. Many of them are about convincing your opponent that you know how to escape. i.e. I can't do the same thing over and over because it won't work. And sometimes all you need is for them to not keep doing the same thing over and over. You will never unlock the ability to choose option B if your opponent thinks that you will always choose option A.
Round 2. Fight.
But let's talk about that in practice. If an Akali player were to believe that every time crouch medium punch is hit, then stand heavy kick can be hit right after, and this is just a thing that will always work, then that's what they'll always do. Dewolf won't actually do this, but it comes up often enough that you probably would get to see the option for it. So if someone has come to the conclusion, yes, I can definitely keep on hitting crouch medium into stand heavy every time, you must come up with some way out of this, or they will always do that. Especially if you're playing a character that actually can get out of bad situations often enough that you have other options. Because you've gone from thinking about, oh right, I need to counter this crouch medium kick crouch medium punch stand heavy kick thing, to, okay, I'm back to playing neutral. And then you make a mistake in neutral, which you probably weren't expecting, got knocked down, and have to quickly reload into your mind, if you're not super practiced, alright, the crouch medium punch heavy kick thing, and by the time you've done that, it's already there again.
Round 1. Fight.
Your opponent similarly was in the mindset of playing all this relatively difficult footsies and other spacing things, which means that when they do get their knockdown or do get their pressure situation, they're not thinking terribly hard about these things. They're thinking, oh, hit buttons. And this persists all the way up to like platinum. And therefore they hit buttons. Having a resolution to the hitting of buttons, regardless of whether or not it is to just parry after every crouch medium punch, you have to delay this by the way, or going for the moonsault after blocking the heavy kick also. It doesn't really matter which of these things happens, it's just enough to make your opponent recognize, I need to stop doing that. But because most people take a little while to actually stop doing that, you, the player, get some good options yourself. You get to keep on doing it for a while longer, all the while thinking about your other good options yourself. How much meter do I have? Can I parry here this time and get a big punish? And so on. Mainly, it increases the stress of the opponent enough that when you do things that aren't correct, they're less likely to punish you. And this is of course something that doesn't work on top level players. It is one of the things that separates people in the mid-ranks from top level players. Simply the fact that you can't confuse top level players down enough that they start dropping things. But we can tell you, if you've never been to a tournament, you'd think that, oh sure, almost all tournament players after like the first round will be at that level. No, they're not. Even at larger tournaments, there's the pro style players, and then there's other people who might get out of pools. And some of them are really good at it, and therefore often place high enough to be considered top players themselves. But there are a lot of players who obviously don't. You don't see them in the consistent top player echelons. And the reason for this is usually that they are surprised when certain things happen.
Necalli wins.
Even top players who don't have time to play the game as much, or don't have time to spend a lot of analysis on everything, or don't spend too much time watching other matches, can be completely flummoxed by a matchup that they have not experienced or seen before much. Sometimes their character will get them through it, sometimes some quick notes or coaching from someone in their circle will get them through it. And sometimes it's just not enough and they end up completely lost.
Let's do this.
Our bots can help you with this, but you have to spend a very large amount of time with them for this purpose, and you have to do so to the point where you can not only beat the bot, but you can beat the bot so comfortably that your thought processes stop being about beating the bot and start being about experimenting with other things while beating it.
Necalli.
See you.
This is a fairly tall ask a lot of the time. But learning all of the little interactions your character has with other characters is part of the fun of fighting games. And many fighting games, these days at least,
Fight.
don't make it so that you will get hurt if you don't know the answer. Defensive mechanics are stronger than ever, Melty Blood being a demonstration of that, and technically a lot of other games recently, other than I guess Strive, have fairly strong defensive mechanics. Now, you end up using up a lot of resources and therefore don't win the matches, but you definitely could get out of situations and practice more things other than sitting there blocking until your opponent decides to stop their pressure. Something that was afforded to us Street Fighter 4 players only by learning to OS certain things. Unfortunately for Sakura, the only thing that really helps when getting into that situation with Necalli is to do the combo of the stand medium punch into the crouch medium kick, which is, I mean, obviously easier when you don't also have to time a charge move in it, but most of the things Sakura wants to do out of it are not easy either. Just know that if you are a Sakura player, you're probably going to have to practice that as well as the back heavy punch version, because the back heavy punch is pretty easy to drop in many situations. And obviously more punishable. But there you see the little thing, and you just saw a demonstration of it for just a moment. You probably even missed it. Sakura can grab Necalli's extended limbs with her throw. So there are many situations where the two of them are in neutral, and Sakura's best option is to whiff throw in front of her. It's hard to explain exactly when this is a good idea, but it's around the same space as you might think of just doing back heavy punch or back heavy kick. And this is something that, as far as I know, works even when you're playing against higher level players. Not because they won't punish you for doing it, but because it's just still worth doing. This comes up in Necalli's matches a lot, actually. There are a lot of scenarios in which Necalli's buttons fall just short of being able to actually punish people if they didn't stick out their own. And because the way that throw works means that the character is not usually extending their hurt box. As far as I know, for those who aren't aware, when a character is crouching in this game, they have a slightly wider hurt box than when they aren't. But everything I know about this game indicates that if you go for a throw, you automatically switch to your standing hurt box. which can lead to situations where you evade something because you go for throw, even though you were crouching. In fact, all of those times you've gone, why didn't that hit? Why did I get grabbed? That's probably the reason. You would only have hit a crouching opponent, and they went for throw, so they suddenly weren't crouching anymore. Here's a good example. Necalli got away from that throw mainly because Necalli went for something that also had the same style of effect. Not extending a hurt box. And that still didn't mean it was a bad idea for Sakura to do that. Because remember, as always, these are meant to change your opponent's behavior. And if they're doing a good enough job of that, then you don't really care. You care when you're low on health, but that definitely means that all of the times you should be working on it is any time before that. It can be hard to remember to do these things as a serious aspect of matchups. Oh, I should play the first half of this match this way. But once you get used to it, usually around gold, it's not so bad anymore. We see Duo switching to the main thing Necalli does that deals with this, hitting light kick instead of going for medium punch or other things. A generally large help, simply because Necalli's light kick is great. It has this deceptive feeling of, wait, did I even get hit? Which often means he can do other things, like dashing forward and getting various other styles of pressure. But because it also stops you from doing so many things, you can't easily jump through or anything like that.
You lose.
So we're seeing a lot of practice from our Necalli paying off in various ways. Presumably that's why he changed to the white hair color, I guess. Necalli is also a good enough character to mention things like trap setups. In this case, putting the crawling beast out in a way that it makes it very difficult for you to do anything on your own wake up. Lots of characters have stuff like this, but many of them don't actually have pressure out of this. This is related to the way things work because of block stun and the way it interacts with throws. Generally, you just keep blocking. Oh, no, there we go. Crawling Beast, however, is not a great thing to just keep blocking. And this is for a really weird and interesting reason. The fact that Necalli's regular grab and Necalli's command grab are on different timings means that the player has a literal grab mix-up. They can walk forward, choose to do one of them, and know which one of them is more likely to get you. This may seem minor, but it's slightly different from just delaying the regular throw, because you can't tech a command grab. So if you felt, okay, I'm just gonna wait, if they go for throw early, I'm not gonna get thrown in the first place, I might get to throw them. But a command grab is a solution to this. You can't move, they might grab you on the first frame they're capable of doing so, and it's slightly easier to time. Gil faces the difficulty of how to parry as well to some extent, simply because should you parry is a bigger question than most other things in here. And this character is relatively linear, so once Necalli is in close, your options are severely limited. He also doesn't have a great cross-up game by comparison. Nor can he just armor through things and it be okay. So a player who is able to vary their startup and so on will tend to have better luck here. They can't be consistently parried, they can't be consistently reacted to, etc. If anything, your option as Gil is usually hit more buttons, particularly crouch medium punch. Which can feel a little weird after having gotten used to characters that don't let you do this at all. But, like most other things, you can learn it over time. Stand light kick works if you forget. And while crouch medium punch isn't the greatest for starting things up, the light kick is pretty decent. Neither of them extends Gil's hurt box far forward, and therefore, at the distances these two characters fight, it's often relatively safe to go. Get counter hits when your opponent tries for something, and just be okay otherwise most of the time. Again, this is about conditioning. If you've gotten your opponent this far, to where you can be hitting those buttons, and where it's a good idea to hit them, then they're going to want to hit more buttons. So if you find yourself thinking, oh, I can't keep getting away with this, they're just going to keep on mashing now, then you can parry. Most of these things are exactly that form of binary. And you should try to keep it in mind for much more complex games where you have to make these decisions way faster.
Gil wins.
There's no point in fearing option A and option B at the same time. Yes, your opponent is also, let's say, flipping the dice, flipping the coin, or whatever. But the point the flip is happening. You can be scared of guessing wrong, but you cannot spend too much time being afraid that the option itself is bad. And making sure your mind has a distinct point because brain, those two things, is super important. Necalli's main option against this is to go for more stomps. This is not a great idea. One, because Gil will just backdash out of stomps. And two, because depending on your facing, you can lose to both the light kick and the medium punch, even though you go for stomp. The whole thing. That's another good reason for choosing this particular V trigger. Enough space between them. They might delay. The upper doom allows you to push them off you entirely, as long as they've opened enough space to do so. And as far as I know, the way that move trades with most normals is that Gil will get hit, but they will still be pushed away. So, relatively win-win situation. With enough training, you can actually train yourself to backdash out of stomp on reaction, and I believe Gil's backdash is similar to Ed's and Bison's where you will make it. Most characters in this game actually can backdash out of stomp, except if Necalli has done it from quite close range. The question is whether or not you could do this on reaction. Mainly because Stomp is a fairly long starting move. You only have a few frames, even depending on your skills, to actually get into position for this. So the amount of space that your character covers in their bat dash within the first few frames of the bat dash is usually the deciding factor in whether or not this works. Characters that don't bat dash particularly well, like Ibuki, tend to get caught in Stomp, whereas characters like Ed and Colleen will almost always just be able to get out. I think that was an input error on the wolf side. And I doubt there was any way to be ready for that. Too many options available.
Gil wins.
Well, we've been down to team members and I've talked a lot, despite intending to stop talking for a bit actually.
It's go time. Let's do this.
Let's see if we have any issues between the two stations today. But that's the 90-minute mark, and usually we don't go much further than that. Of course, the lounge doesn't always close immediately, and if people jump in toward the end, they can generally expect to face off with at least 2 or 3 people.
Gil.
Ah, this
The
costume
time has arrived. Come.
absolutely should be banned. Capcom, I don't know whose idea this was, but that person should be given a generous severance package. Because, you know, I don't want to say they should just be fired. It's not like it's a terrible idea. But I also don't want to say they should be paid and get no consequences. So that's my compromise there.
Round 1. Fight.
Anyways, allow me to rant about this for a while. I don't know if it's actually banned in CP2 or not, but as you can see, this costume is awful. Its colors are awful. Its shifting colors are awful. The visual distortion is, like, basically the reason why it should be banned. This is worse than Blanca-chan. Oh no, are you responsible for this?
Round 2. Fight.
You'll notice that against Sakura, Miss Fine has chosen the skill and the trigger one, which obviously drastically changes matchups in general. But this isn't really because Sakura's likely to play from far away and throw fireballs. It's actually related to something else. It's that it gives Gil so much better situations on knockdown. You can also use it to try to have projectile wars because it's basically just free projectiles forever. But In any case, I think I've sort of disabled the team, so I will get out of my Gazelles way now before their next match starts. Do you realize that this man's butt disappears? Like, it just vanishes into thin air.
Round one. Fight!
Once you see it, you can't unsee it. Anyway, the inappropriate references alone should be grounds for ban. But one could argue that the players are not generally hearing the commentators, so I guess it's okay.
Round two. Fight!
On a more serious note, part of the reason why this is important, and why Blanca-chan is a problem, and why this one is a problem, is that a lot of the time people learn to recognize what's happening on the screen, especially in busy stages like this one, by watching the silhouette of their opponent's character. That's just how human brains and eyes work. So to have a character who constantly has a shifting silhouette is even worse than Blanca-chan, where yes, you technically have to learn the silhouettes of two different characters, but that's fine. You can learn to fight against Dan in costume, and you can learn to fight against Blanca in costume, and you can learn to fight against Blanca in other weird Blanca costume, and Blanca is by nature a trolly character whose moves don't even rely on you being able to read the silhouette in the first place. Gil is the opposite of that on every level.
You win! It's go time!
Fortunately, through incapacitating just comment, we are not likely to see that character in that costume again for the stream, at least. You can completely count that she fought that match on a handicap.
Union Graveyard. Sakura Akira.
風間明行きます。
Round one. Fight!
Ah, the mirror match. I'm convinced that the only difference between these two characters is whose brother is younger and whose brother is older. It's not inconceivable that Sakura, had she had an older brother of certain specific inclinations, could have ended up being a scary biker too.
Final round. Fight.
After all, she is the type to be somewhat influenced. If you disagree, I don't think you understand this character's story very well. Overall, the similarity of movements actually makes the matchup fairly difficult, because there is practically no way to tell what one should be aiming for at any given time, even on knockdowns, because they both have invincible uppercuts. Now, obviously, these are both risky moves, but similar to Guile, the fact that they're there means you have to control certain things. There are also characters who don't get much off of specific situations, which means that their pressure, you can't say it's really limited, but if you've learned to look at it, if you've learned what it looks like, it's easier to get out of it. Therefore, a lot of this has to do with reactions and weird pressure situations. And they're capable of fighting each other fairly effectively using specials from even 2, I'd say, body lengths away, or rather, stance lengths away. Which of course leads to this sort of thing. Literally,
Round 2. Fight.
obviously the stream is it for the thematic of this stage. I wish you all a happy All Hallows. Must it always be this way? Yes, probably. Players understand each other's rhythm quite a lot.
Final round.
And when Constantine Dynasty, i.e. Rune Sirens, is not playing Karine, into position for certain things is harder. This is a map between two very similar secondaries, but the players understand each other's mindsets well enough in their primaries, in characters, that you get this sort of outcome. It looks as if they are playing a bit wildly in neutral. The properties of their moves actually mean that it doesn't really come up. If you space most of the things they do just right, the problem that the opponent faces is not can they punish it, it's should they respond in the first place, because if they respond, sometimes they'll get tapped, even if very lightly, and sometimes if they don't respond or go, okay, I'm going to block, various things about the proximity block in the game might cause them to end up at disadvantage. It's not a common thing that comes up though. That said, it looks like we're about to go into the last on-stream match of the night. As noted before, this is a Atlantic Rim lounge, more or less. You can feel free to jump in, just look for Rune Siren as lounge host. I'm not sure how much longer it's going, usually you get another 45 minutes or so. Depends on who's interested in continuing. But there's usually at least 2 people around for a while longer, so if you want a turn at it and just don't want to be on stream for any reason, jump on in. We delayed our Melty bot, mainly because there was a patch and we aren't sure what effects this patch has. Games of that level, as many issues as we seem to have on PC version, could go through sufficiently large changes either to functionality or otherwise. I actually have to redo it anyway, or think about things differently. I haven't actually had a chance to review the patch notes in length, but basically the uncertainty meant, no, let's not bother doing this, we're just gonna have to redo it. And if we don't, then all that's really lost is 1 week of delay on the release of work we've already done, so probably fine. Therefore you should expect more bot this week, and possibly, finally, Melty streams. Most of us are definitely not good, but certainly power enough for characters that it won't be a complete blow up unless someone else who has actually played a lot jumps in, in which case it's a blow up of the type we like.
Round 2. Fight.
Melty Blood is more so complicated in terms of outcomes, and that's something I'll talk about on any stream we do have, but the main thing to understand if you're not into the game yet is that it really isn't that much more complicated than this one. There's slightly more movement because obviously it's what people call an anime game and you can jump 3 times and air dash and other things. But in terms of the overall moment-to-moment interactions, aside from being faster, it's not that different. It isn't even at the level of the whole full screen neutral that you see in Under Night. Some characters can do things like that, but I mean, Street Fighter has characters like that. You do have to face Poison and Dhalsim occasionally. And Sagat for all intents and purposes. So, when you do get to see anything from us, it's to be the same sorts of things. What Melty has is a lot of small interactions that change the capacities of your character as you fight.
Round 1.
So, I've activated this, so I have this much jump. I've activated this, so I have this much more armor. The sort of things you learn in Street Fighter without thinking about it. They're just codified into not so much a character, but the whole game system, which technically makes it easier to understand rather than harder. The hard part is of course recognizing, well, this character uses that tool much differently than this other one. And that's something we feel the need to work into our bots as best we can. This isn't a common thing in Under Night, actually. In Under Night, for the most part, yes, you gain something from being in Warple state, and your GRD gauge has specific functions, but that's really nowhere near the level of mechanics and things that Melty does. In Melty, the question is, should I try to use this way, rather than should I try to use this in this matchup?
Round 2. Fight.
But this is mainly because they didn't want to oversimplify the game, and most people have been very positive toward that. You can absolutely still play Melty, just not necessarily with much hope of winning serious matches. without understanding most of this, and if you think, why can't I solve this problem? There's probably a solution in there, and someone needs to tell you more game mechanics in order to make it work. Unfortunately, I just don't have the time to get into literally all of them, so whenever we do get around to such content, please watch out for things I say that are not accurate. In fact, it'll be one of those situations where I'm more likely to do Melty streams only when I know that I have a fact checker in the audience to make sure that I'm saying things that make sense.
You win.
And of course, I hope to catch up eventually, as it is a really enjoyable game for most of the time that I've touched it, and nearly everything I've seen, even though the parts of it that some people consider interesting are not necessarily the parts that technically are. I think I can go that far as to say that.
Round one. Fight.
If you were to wear within 19 days, I believe it is, or possibly 14, I'll check it, we will be experiencing the King of Fighters 15 Open Beta. This is likely to be somewhat limited as it's a 3-on-3 game with only 8 beta characters for testing. But you'll see at least a little content from us, I think, as at least 2 team members have what we could consider full teams to play. And therefore we can at least do the full exploration of all the mechanics and play somewhat seriously, even if it's just the equivalent of a demo for our purposes. Street Fighter content will, as always, continue, basically every Monday, and we're likely to be taking it quite a bit more seriously going forward.
Round two. Fight.
But overall, since most of the time people in the Platinum and Diamond tier who are willing to just join regardless of any rank they see, we're not terribly interested in leveling up just yet, unless it's suddenly going to start attracting players beyond that. And most of the time that would be a terrible idea because we don't keep up with those players generally anyway. Nothing but respect to all those people who have time to play these games very seriously, but as is probably obvious, our goal is not that. Our goal is to make as much progress as possible in the limited time available, and to help out anyone else with a similar situation. You'll definitely see us binge these games sometimes and just go on a big ranking up spree. But you shouldn't generally expect that we're going to be great at them. We're here to make other people who are in the same situation as great as possible at them themselves, or at least get you to the point where you understand why you're losing.
Final round. Fight.
As we go toward the winter months in the Northern Hemisphere of the US, you will also see us get a lot more of this content as a whole. And possibly some other random weird content that we generally wouldn't have wanted to cover before. Mainly because it would cause burnout on those times where bots were actually a thing. But with Melty bots being the way they are, they match the Unist model where you basically can't make them too complicated because they can't be saved between game sessions. And only one more character for Street Fighter V, who I have no idea. There's no way to predict whether or not the bot for this character will be interesting, good, or difficult.
You lose.
We're unlikely to branch out beyond fighting game content, at least for quite a while, though, so you should generally expect that that's all you're going to see. That said, that brings us to the end of our stream for tonight, and as noted, jump on in if you want to have some matches. This has been Rillian for Team 2MK. You can find all our bots at our website 2-mk.org, and any information about what and when we're playing at 2_MK_FGC on Twitter. Good luck with your training, and good night everyone.